to Everyday Nonviolence. This podcast is produced by Friends for a Nonviolent World, or FNVW. FNVW works to promote and create peace and justice in our community by using the principles and practices of nonviolence to transform conflict and to address the root causes of violence. The Everyday Nonviolence podcast highlights people whose stories deepen our understanding of violence and whose lives demonstrate the many ways nonviolence can promote healing and social change.
Hello everyone, my name is Emily Roe. I am a sophomore student at the University of Minnesota Twin Cities, and I will be your host for this episode of the Everyday Nonviolence podcast. Joining me today is our guest, Kyle Tran Myhre. Kyle, also known by a stage name Guante, is a poet and activist whose work explores the relationships between narrative power and resistance. Whether writing about men's roles or ending gender violence, challenging dominant narratives related to race, or just telling stories of the different jobs he's had, he strives to cultivate a deeper engagement with social justice issues. He completed his master's degree at the University of Minnesota with a focus on spoken word, critical pedagogy, and social justice education, and regularly facilitates workshops in residency. He's performed at the United Nations, been a member of 2 National Poetry Slam Championship teams, and has visited countless colleges, conferences, and festivals, using storytelling as doorways into critical dialogue. Kyle, thank you so much for joining us today. So the first question I thought, just to kind of dive right in, was what brought you into your work? What background inspired this path of yours?
So because I do a lot of work with high schoolers and young people around writing, one of the first stories I get to tell is that it makes no sense that this is my job because I am personally the most quiet, shy, introverted person in the universe. And yet my job is to stand up in front of people and talk. And so in terms of like, how did that actually happen? It was all through relationships. You know, it was never in my own head telling myself that I wanted to be a performer or that I wanted to be up on a stage. It was having friends who would kind of drag me along with them to the open mic or the poetry slam. And not to mention also like the activist meeting or the rally. And like the way that I got engaged in the stuff that I do today was purely through relationships, through other people.
Yeah, I remember when I first saw your presentation at my school that you mentioned that when you were standing up there, you felt a lot of anxiety and was kind of a ball of nerves. And that really humanized the work for me. Thank you.
That's great to hear. Thank you.
Next, kind of diving more specifically into some of the topics that you speak about, I know that you've written about men's roles in ending gender violence, which is a topic that we previously explored on the podcast. What led to your interest in this issue specifically?
So I got into that work again through relationships, through happening to have mentors who kind of brought me into the work that they were already doing. And this was probably when I was 19, 20, 21 years old. It was not something that I grew up thinking a lot about. I think like a lot of young men, it's not something that we think about, the idea of unless we experience it ourselves in our households, but the idea of domestic violence, gender-based violence, things like that. And then I think, going to college, being a college student and being exposed to kind of the diversity of opinions and perspectives and experiences in that space was part of it. But then also having specific people of multiple gender identities working on that issue and whose life's work was organizing around that and doing narrative shifting work around gender issues and gender-based violence issues, and having them actually kind of reach out and kind of take me under their wing, made all the difference. So again, not to sound like a broken record, but so much of this work, I think, and you could probably extrapolate that out to lots of different kinds of activist work, is driven by relationships, by actual people that we are in community with.
That's such a good point that you bring up about how relationships are kind of what strengthens movements. Do you kind of see yourself as that mentor for other people now?
I try to be. I think I try to be someone who can share resources And if I have any insight, I'll share that insight. But I think specifically sharing resources and contacts and opportunities with younger people who are, in my community who are trying to get into this kind of work. When I say this kind of work, whether that is the kind of activism and advocacy stuff that I do, or just on the art side, who are trying to build a career for themselves as artists. The only reason that I am where I am today is because people took the time to share those kinds of resources with me. And I feel, obligated in a good way, not in a burdensome way. I feel obligated in a very positive way to keep sharing those resources, to keep that thread going.
Yeah, that's awesome. Kind of along those lines, I'm a big listener of Fred Again, and I noticed that you actually collaborated with him on a few songs, one of them being one of my favorites. I was curious how collaboration in this way or other ways has played a role in kind of facilitating your work within the social justice realm.
It's a funny example because, it's one of the more high profile, obviously, collaborations that I've done. And it wasn't super, super intense on that kind of relationship side. Like, we've never met in real life. We've talked on the internet a few times, and he kind of sampled a poem that I had already written 10 years ago and put it in the song. And then we collaborated on another song more recently, that I wrote something original for. But I think the thing that I would pull out from that is, even though our collaboration as two people wasn't super, super in depth, I think the idea that collaboration opens doors and it brings people into your work who maybe wouldn't have been exposed to your work otherwise is a really key point. And so when I try to collaborate with people, in my community, when I am collaborating more in depth, whether that be with a producer or another poet or even on an activist level, kind of relationship building, it still goes back to the idea of how do we open more doors? How do we bring more people into the work through coming together? When it is so easy, I say this not as a platitude, but it's something that I feel tension around and struggle with myself. It is so easy to silo myself off and be like, I'm going to do my work over here in this corner and everyone else just leave it alone, because that's, naturally what I want to say a lot of times. And so I think whether it is something high profile, like the Fred Again collaboration, or something that is maybe harder to see in my bio or in the stuff that people actually know me for, I think in both cases, when we are able to reach out and work together with other people, it creates so much more space to create something that's bigger than the sum of its parts, to bring more people into the work. I guess the idea is that you never know what the ripple effects of a particular project are going to be and who that's going to reach. And that's such an important lesson for artists, but it's also, I think, a really important lesson for activists and advocates.
I think that it's really important to emphasize, again, that interconnectedness and how it's like you can kind of connect with someone in this niche sphere and then they can kind of explore from there.
I will just say really, really briefly, it's funny because, because of the work that I do, I'm up in front of people all the time. A lot of times college students, sometimes high school students, sometimes just adults, just random people. And in any group of 100 or 300 people who are at one of my events, it's a tiny handful will know me because of the spoken word stuff that I've done that has gone viral over the years. And, people might have grown up watching slam poetry videos on YouTube or something. And then 99% of everyone else will have no idea who I am. And then another 1 or 2% of people will know me because of the Fred Again thing. And 99% of people have no idea who I am. And like you said, it's these little kind of moments in our lives, these little kind of niche projects and things that I keep going back to the idea of opening doors and creating space. And I don't want to just repeat myself over and over, but I do think that's such an important part of this work that art especially isn't just about the art itself. It's about how it puts people in a room together who would maybe not be in a room together otherwise. And I find that really inspiring.
Along that line, how do you feel that art can serve as this nonviolent method to address social justice concerns? How do you think that people can be drawn in with that art?
Yeah, that's a great question. 3 things come to mind for me. One is on a very, very individual level, there's this idea that we all have stuff kind of swirling around inside of us, whether it is anger or grief or confusion or frustration or whatever. And this is very, very straightforward. It's important that we have somewhere to put that stuff, right? And sometimes it can come out in a constructive way. And a lot of that could be art, right? Writing poems, creating music. it could be things like, working out or playing a sport or something. And it could also be like destructive things, like getting into a bar fight or something. I don't know. And so like on a very, very, very like individual level, that the power of art, I think is in that, like having some kind of outlet for that energy. But then of course, there's also the interpersonal level, and then there's also kind of the larger scale cultural level. I think about at both of those levels, there's something there about, narratives. This is what my presentation that I think you saw was about, the fundamental importance of one, like identifying the kind of dominant narratives that are always flowing around us about different issues, about different people, about different places. Like, what are the stereotypes? What are the stories that are told over and over and over again to the point that we don't even see them anymore? It's like being able to identify them, but also being able to tell our own stories. That's such a fundamental part of an arts practice, is having a space and developing the skill to tell our own stories and say like, yes, you might have these assumptions about me, but this is who I am, and this is what I believe, and this is the community that I represent. And I think that's really important. And then just the last thought I have here kind of relates to what we've been talking about, is that an arts practice is so important, not just because of the art itself, but because of the relationships, the community that can kind of sprout around the art. So much of, whether we're talking the world of nonviolence and nonviolence direct organizing, we'll talk about transformative justice, and we talk about, all the different things that have been on your show and the work that you do. Like, it's funny how much of that boils down to having space for people to sit down and talk to each other and like work out problems and actually build those relationships versus relying on kind of older structural notions of power and control and dominance. But when we can just talk to each other. And of course, that doesn't have to be through art, but art can be a powerful channel for that.
Yeah. Do you find that art is maybe a more engaging way for people to enter into those critical conversations? I know that sometimes students may not be as engaged with things if they don't have that connection. Do you think that this particular path engages people a little bit more?
Oh, that's such a good question. And it's also kind of a loaded question in the sense that I am a poet, right? And so like, I want to say, yes, like by using poetry, I can make an abstract idea come to life for the audience. I can put a human face on something that people maybe haven't thought about before. And I do think that that's true. And I think, different tools work for different jobs and like for different audiences. And I think there are certainly people who do not want to hear a spoken word poem about white supremacy or about critical masculinities, right? And for some people, the kind of old fashioned PowerPoint presentation is going to be more powerful. For some people, the poem is going to be more powerful. For some people, none of that is going to work, and it has to be through actual like life experiences that they have. And I think for most of us, it's a combination of things. I think about the work that I do as very much a supplement to other kinds of work, right? So just to use that very, very specific example of like, I do a lot of work around consent. I always try to tell the colleges or the schools that book me, what I do is probably not the consent training that every student needs to go through. I think what I do is an extra thing. It's like once that seed has already been planted, what I can do is try to water that seed a little bit, or vice versa. Maybe I plant the seed and then through more intentional programming and trainings, they continue to water it. But I love that idea of diversity of tactics, and where like art is not the magical thing that makes the world turn, but it can help. It can be one tool in a larger process.
I appreciate that perspective because I think a lot of people might not know how to engage in it and then proceed to be kind of ignorant or not want to get involved. So I think that's a great way to put that. I know we've talked a lot about relationships and kind of about how connection can bring people into the work. So I just wanted to briefly mention how I came to know you. I became aware of Kyle through his work with the College of Liberal Arts at my school. He kind of facilitated a conversation about identity and narrative. So I wanted to ask, other than college students, what other communities do you primarily work with? How do you see this impact of your work?
It's hard to break it down into specific pie chart fractions, but I think a lot of the work that I do is with undergrads in college. But then the next kind of group of people who I work with the most are probably teenagers. Sometimes that is through, I do residency work. Here in Minnesota, I work with organizations like Compass and True Art Speaks, where they will place, a poet or a visual artist or a dancer in a classroom. It might just be for a week at a time. It might be for a semester. It might be for a single day. Like every situation is different. A lot of the work that I do is kind of residency based, where I'm the person who's facilitating the poetry unit for the week. But then I also do kind of the similar stuff to what you're talking about with high school students too, where it's maybe more about leadership or agency or identity or a community organizing, one-on-one kind of conversation. It's hard to talk about what I do. Like, it's hard to have a good elevator pitch because it is so all over the place. It's like different age groups in different situations talking about different things. But I think the thread that connects a lot of it is kind of what you pointed to with that CLA presentation. It was narrative, the idea of identifying the stories that are flowing around us and also telling our own stories. Like, I think whether that is purely an arts-based thing, we can have that conversation in like a high school, whether that is more of a specific thing around a specific social justice topic, we can have that conversation. But it all comes together through that lens of the power of storytelling and how every culture on earth has some analog to the storyteller or, the griot, the person who passes along the values or the history of a people or a place through an artistic process.
How have you seen your work impact these communities and kind of come to fruition?
I think the easy answer to that, easy and hard, is that you don't always see it. It's kind of a cliche, but I also think it's a useful metaphor, the idea of planting seeds, that like you plant seeds, you're not always going to be around to harvest them. Part of the work is just telling stories and sharing perspectives and knowing that people are listening to you, whether or not they stand up and applaud and love you or buy your book or, buy your album later or anything, to know that they're listening. And that particularly around the more kind of specific issue-based stuff that I do around consent and gender violence prevention and healthy masculinity, I know that a lot of times in those spaces, it's not going to be an instant, like I'd say a poem and then suddenly all the men are like, oh, they're crying and they can't believe how they've been wrong their whole lives. Like that never, ever happens. It's much more about, again, like I said, either I'm planting the seed or maybe a seed has already been planted and I'm watering it. But I think art plays such an important role in that kind of work. And then, of course, there are, here and there are times where I do get to see, like, here's a student I worked with when they were 16 and now they've got their own, their debut poetry book is coming out. And like, not, I would never try to take responsibility or credit for that, but to know that you can be a lily pad in someone's journey, is a really powerful feeling.
I think it sounds super powerful that you can kind of see that continuity over time while also knowing that maybe you did have an effect that you'll never see, but you can still feel good about it.
Another thought on that seeing the effects of your work thing. I also try to think about that not as just an individual, but as someone who is part of a much, 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 much broader movement of people doing the kind of work that I do. And I think when we reframe it from an individual thing to a collective thing, then it becomes a little bit easier to talk about some of the changes that I'm seeing. So, in my bio, it says like I performed at the United Nations. And I think when I perform there, it's not because I'm, the most incredible poet in the world. It's because they were having a conference on men's roles in disrupting gender-based violence around the world. And I was just one of many, many speakers talking through that. And, I shared a poem. And I think the fact that conference was happening at the United Nations at that level, again, it had nothing to do with me. It speaks to the collective effort of advocates and organizers and survivors and, people on campuses and in communities all around the country and all around the world, like really changing the narrative in a very, very specific, powerful way. Another good example of that is 15 years ago, the framework around consent and like sexual violence, like on campus could be like a no means no framework. And like through the work of, again, writers and organizers and activists throughout the years, that has really shifted to a yes means yes framework, the idea of affirmative consent and, campuses having affirmative consent policies. And I think it shows that like narrative change is not just a talking point or like a buzzword. It is a thing that really, really does happen. And, a million other examples we could talk about there.
I think it's important to kind of contextualize your own actions in the greater sphere. Sometimes you might feel like nothing's happening or no change is happening and kind of ask yourself, what am I doing this for? So I think that's a great point of being able to incorporate your work in the bigger movement. I know you've been doing this work for a decent amount of time. You've produced a lot of albums, books. You've done it on a variety of topics. So this might be a challenging question, but I was curious, is there one thing, project, or topic in particular that you find yourself either most proud of or most passionate about?
I don't know how common this is for artists in general, but I know I tend to have a recency bias in that, I kind of discount everything I did before 6 months ago, but then the last thing that I did, I'm really proud of. And in this case, I think that's my most recent book is called Not a Lot of Reasons to Sing, But Enough. It came out through Button Poetry last year. It's a book that I'm proud of, partly for just aesthetic reasons. It's a weird, science fiction concept poetry book. It's about a robot poet and their human apprentice traveling across a prison colony moon. And then the poems in the book are the poems that they share, but also the poems that they hear from the people in the villages. And so it's this very multivocal, weird thing, which was just fun to write. I needed to step outside the kind of expectation of what a poetry book is supposed to be, which is all, confessional, first person, I am the voice and I am the poem, constructions. So I wanted to do something weird, but then on a content level, which maybe relates more to, this podcast even, it's a book that allowed me to talk about certain issues from a different angle than how I usually talk about them. I've written a ton about violence and violence prevention, and through the lens of talking about, masculinity, but also whiteness and white supremacy and capitalism and all the different kind of structures of oppression that exist in our world. And so writing this book that took place on a different world was a way to challenge myself. How can I write about these same things that are so important that I want to be writing about from a completely new angle, from a completely fresh angle? And so it's still a book about masculinity and about kind of abolition and prisons and policing, but without any of the pop culture references, without any of the historical references that we would normally use or that I would normally use. And I can't tell anyone whether or not that was successful as an artistic project. That's up to the reader to decide. But for me, it was just really, really healthy as a challenge, but also as a way to express myself and how I was feeling.
That's awesome. Yeah, I've never heard of poetry in that sci-fi narrative context. That's super interesting. Going off of that, you mentioned that you wrote this because you needed to take that moment for yourself to kind of have fun with it. Would you say that you prioritize self-care when working in this nonviolent sphere?
Again, a really great question. I could give a very simple answer, oh yeah, self-care is great. There's a complexity in that question around, what is the function of your artistic practice for you? And it's something that I work with students around. There's not necessarily a right or wrong answer to that, but it can be really helpful to have some intentionality around, why am I doing this? Why am I creating this work? Why am I standing up in front of a bunch of strangers and talking about it? And I think the way that those conversations often go is that for a lot of people when they're first getting started, and not just when they're getting started, this could be at any point along someone's journey, but I think especially for people who are getting started, it's very, very internal. It's very, very personal. It's I'm writing because, again, I have something inside me that I need to get out. I'm writing because I'm processing different things that I've been through, and writing is a healthy way for me to process that. And I'm just doing it for myself. I think for all of us as artists, there's always some elements of that, whether it's 90% of the work or 10% of the work. But then for me, as I've gotten older, it really has been about, for better or worse, this can be controversial, but thinking more externally, thinking about the context of the work. Where does this poem live in the world? How can this poem be useful in the world beyond just being useful for my own kind of self-care or self-expression? I'm most proud of poems that have been used in things like trainings, right? That are useful for clarifying particular issues for people who have already gotten the PowerPoint presentation and the 3 bullet points of definitions, but are looking for something a little more narrative or a little more artistic to make that point in a I want to say a deeper way, but just in a different way. So my own personal practice now is very much you never lose the self-expression part of it, but it is very much about thinking, how can this be useful in the world?
Yeah. So would you say that you prioritize that intentionality now a little bit more than you might have in the past?
Yeah, I think so. And I think that's a perfectly natural kind of progression for an artist, is that intentionality often comes later, because when you're starting out, you're just kind of experimenting and having fun. And like, you don't necessarily know even what the options are for an intentional artistic practice or whatever. And, I think that makes so much sense. And I think that was my own journey as well. Just kind of figuring things out as you go along, getting advice and getting perspective from mentors and like people in my community, but also, having fun and playing. I think the word play is an important word.
Awesome. I think it's important for people to remember that not all of the work has to be really hard or draining, but sometimes it can be fun and you can kind of enjoy yourself.
Yeah, I mean, especially coming from the world of spoken word and slam poetry specifically, I could go off on a very long tangent about all of this stuff. But I think in a very general sense, like, a lot of people tend to understand poetry as primarily a written thing. Like, you go to the store and you buy a poetry book, or you go get an MFA and you publish your own poetry book or whatever. And I think there's nothing wrong with that. But my own experience as a poet has been much, 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 much more about things like poetry slams and open mics, where it's a room full of 100 people and a dozen people are performing, and you hear the audience's response and you talk to each other afterwards about like, oh, that was really amazing how you did XYZ, or I wonder what would happen if you did this revision. And like, it's so much more of a collective thing where we are in community together. That's had a huge impact on how I approach art as a practice.
Would you say that you find your work, specifically in poetry and spoken word, more impactful? Or do you think that depends on the person?
I think of my own poems as performance art first and as text second, right? So I think of the book as kind of not so much here is a book of poems, but here is a book of transcripts of my poems, because the first thing in my own mind as a writer is, how am I going to perform this? Or how is this going to sound on stage in front of a bunch of people? Or where am I going to pause dramatically? And like thinking through some of those things. Again, the word there is like intentionality, even on an aesthetic level. But as a performer, thinking about how that all will play out. Other poets, there are a million overlaps between page poetry and performance poetry. And like, there's a million different ways to approach the work. That just happens to be mine.
Cool. We were curious, is there a short piece of poetry of yours that you would like to share with us on this episode?
This is one of the shorter poems in my book, and it touches on a lot of the stuff that we've talked about in this conversation about kind of perspective and narrative. Something that comes up in every conversation about art and activism and like the power of art within a movement context tends to be about imagination and like helping us imagine a different world. And I think, one, that's very true. Like, it is very, very important for us to be able to imagine the world that we're working toward, especially in the context of like nonviolence, and like that kind of work, because it does push up against the kind of dominant narrative about how things are done or how you're supposed to be in the world. And so being able to imagine it first is really important. But then I also think imagination is also about the actual work itself, like being imaginative and creative about how we push this work forward. Again, it'd be another hour-long conversation to get into specific details, but I'll share the poem. It's called City of Heart. Steal to eat. Distribute banned critiques of the hoarders and exploiters via hand-copied leaflet, break a bully's face and laugh. It is so easy to do the right thing and find yourself on the wrong side of the law. Like the street we all know that separates the bad side of the city from the side they say you're not allowed on. Right or wrong is poetry. Legal or illegal is math. An equation with one answer, black or white, like so much of their little world. To them, you are either inside or outside the cage, either citizen or non-citizen, male or female, I or not I. Streets run either north, south, or east, west. It's how they were built, how it's always been. Remember then, when you run, where you love this city, your pursuers will only ever love its map, the straight lines and borders, the twin nightsticks of x-axis and y-axis climb up a wall, disappear. So again, not to explain the poem, but because I always have my teacher hat on, is like the kind of driving metaphor is that idea of a flat x-axis and y-axis and how everything always happens on that plane. And yet as soon as you take a step onto the z-axis, you're completely somewhere else. And I feel like that call toward creativity in our resistance and creativity in the narrative work, the stories that we're telling, the narratives that we're seeding is really, really important to kind of not just win the game, but don't play by the rules that have been set for you, but to break those rules in intentional ways. And so again, maybe not the perfect example, but it's a poem that I enjoy.
Yeah, I think that's a metaphor that's really applicable to what we've talked about today. I think that's a sample of work that the listeners can connect to and maybe discover more for themselves. One last question I have. How can listeners find you outside of this podcast and in the world?
Yeah. So again, my name is Kyle Tran Myhre, but for many years I went by the stage name Guante, and I'm trying to just go by my actual name, but my website is still guante.info. So GUANTE.info. And then I'm also on, Instagram at Guante Solo. And then my book, is in bookstores and libraries. It's called Not a Lot of Reasons to Sing, But Enough. Not to just keep going on and on with a million ways people can get in touch with me, but you mentioned the Fred Again stuff, and you can find Guante on Spotify, and at least one of the Fred Again songs is part of that, but then all my other songs are part of that too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you for listening to Everyday Nonviolence. To learn more about Friends for a Nonviolent World, visit our website at fnvw.org or call 651-917-0383. We hope you will subscribe so that you don't miss future episodes and insightful conversations. Please note that the views expressed in this podcast are those of the host and guest and are not intended to reflect the official positions of FNVW, its staff, or board of directors.